Every town has its dark side. On this date 50 years ago, a group of men tortured and murdered 3 victims during a heist at an Ogden electronics store. Ogden police arrive at the hi-fi stereo store to investigate a crime unlike any seen in the city before. 3 persons were murdered in Ogden in 1974, scaring the town. Friends, the footage and material used in this video are non-copyrighted. I can't use the real, original footage because it's copyrighted, and that could lead to copyright issues. That's why I use non-copyrighted material in my videos to avoid any problems. If you're really interested, you can search for it on Google, okay. This is a cruel and unusual crime that continues to affect the state of Utah to this day. And, despite being one of the most violent events in American history, many people are unaware of the complete narrative. What began as an ordinary heist at a nearby electronics store suddenly escalated into a horrendous act of brutality. One so filthy that even veteran investigators were disgusted. Torture, execution-style murders, and unspeakable cruelty. The saddest element is that the criminals expressed no remorse. Hello, this is Andrew, and thank you for checking into another episode of Every Town. Today, we're looking into a case that will leave you dumbfounded. This is not for the faint of heart, so be advised. Now, let's head to Ogden, Utah, to learn the truth about the hi-fi killings. Ogden is a charming little city about 40 minutes north of Salt Lake. Mountains as far as the eye can see, surrounded by streets lined with houses and homes. Today, the population is around 87,000. However, in 1974, when our story takes place, it was not even half that. Back then, there was no sign of corporate America entering. The majority of the shops and restaurants were tiny family companies. Among them was the Hi-Fi Shop, located at 2323 Washington Boulevard, one of the town's main thoroughfares. The Hi-Fi was a home audio shop, which is completely antiquated today. However, back then, you would go there to buy speakers and record players, or to have your radio system, music, serviced. On the evening of April 22, 1974, Stanley Walker, 20, and Michelle Ansley, 18, were working the closing shift. It was a Monday, one of the slowest days of the week, so they were clearing up and preparing to clock out. As the two of them prepared to shut up, the bell above the door sounded, announcing that someone had entered. However, this was not a customer. It was more than simply one person. 4 men stormed into the establishment, waving their firearms. They rapidly overpowered Stanley and Michelle, leaving them little choice than to cooperate. These were essentially kids doing minimum wage jobs with no firearms. They used their hands and feet to force them down to the store's basement before returning to the main floor. And their goal was evident. They appeared to have come to plunder the place, and that is exactly what transpired. From the outside, the intruders had 2 vans ready to transport all of the stolen valuables. While left terrified in the cellar, Stanley and Michelle prayed that the robbers would quickly take what they wanted and disappear. But Miss Knight was just getting started. And it should have been nothing more than a financial loss for the store owner. An inconvenience involving insurance claims and paperwork would become one of Utah's most infamous crimes, radically affecting the lives of 5 people. I had no idea what was going on inside because, after all, this was Ogden, where nothing happened very often. Courtney Nesbitt, 16, arrived at the store approximately an hour after the robbery began. He had just dropped by to thank his friend Stanley for allowing him park in the company lot earlier that day while completing some errands nearby. Courtney entered through the door, but he didn't see his pal Stanley. Instead, he was confronted by a stranger who pointed a gun at him. Before Courtney could realize what was going on, he was handcuffed and forced downstairs into the basement, where he encountered a horrified Stanley and Michelle. Courtney's circumstance was a tragic example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Michelle, too, had accidentally stumbled into fate's dreadful clutches that night, despite the fact that she had not been scheduled to work that evening. She merely agreed to cover a shift for a co-worker out of the kindness of her heart. And time was going by. The guy snatched things with ease. Nobody was around to bother them. But someone was anxious because their kid had not returned home as usual after work. That was Stanley's father, Orrin. He got concerned, which was entirely out of character. Stanley, for example, always called ahead of time if he expected to arrive late. But that night, he said nothing. Orrin walked inside his car and decided to inspect himself. I drove down to the hi-fi store. Within moments of entering, he realized where Stanley was, as he, too, was tied up and hauled downstairs with the rest of the crew. And the basement population was steadily expanding. The robbers panicked, and too many people had spotted them by this point. Their scheme was collapsing. They were losing control. But another victim would soon be added to the list. Courtney's mother, 52-year-old Carol Nesbitt, became anxious when her son failed to return home. And she drove to the firm to explore what was going on and soon found herself in the basement, becoming the fifth and last prisoner. Music: the robbers seized around $24,000 worth of electrical goods before escaping, leaving the 5 victims behind. After being detained in the cellar for another 3 hours, the hostages were discovered by Orrin's wife, Stanley's mother. She, too, had become concerned when her kid and husband were unavailable. When she entered the shop, she could hear noises coming from the basement. They knocked down the door, along with her second son, but nothing could have prepared her for the nightmare they were about to discover. Her son Stanley had already left, as had his co-worker, Michelle, who was 18 years old. Carol Nesbitt and her son Courtney were barely surviving, their bodies scarred by the trauma they had suffered. Warren Walker was still alive, although in critical condition. Emergency services arrived quickly, but Carol had already missed her chance. She died from her injuries shortly after being transported to St. Benedict's Hospital. Courtney remained unconscious. His body was damaged from the tremendous cruelty he had endured, and physicians were unclear whether he would ever wake up. This left Orrin as the lone conscious survivor and the only way for investigators to learn what had really happened in the basement that night. So, what did happen? How did a heist result in the deaths of 3 innocent victims? Orrin stated that while they were down there, they overheard 2 of the men discussing retrieving something from one of the 2 vans outside. One of the thieves was eventually sent away, and he returned a few minutes later with a bottle hidden in a brown paper bag, while 2 of the men made their way down the basement steps with the worst of intentions. At this time, one of them partially released Orrin from his handcuffs, while another poured a glass of the bluish-green liquid from the mysterious bottle and handed it to Orrin, instructing him to distribute it to the other detainees. The father declined. He was not going to take part in whatsoever they were planning. The robbers were frustrated and immediately restrained him again. If he refused, they would do it themselves. The captors made the 5 prisoners sit against the wall. One of the men calmly assured them that the beverage, which was a combination of vodka and sleeping tablets, was safe. He claimed that its sole function was to render them unconscious so that they could flee unhindered. By the time they woke up, it would all be finished, and they would be able to return home safely to their families and pretend as if nothing had occurred. With no choice but to obey, they each drank part of the wine. However, the instant the drink met their lips, they realized it was not a cocktail. No sedatives. Because the chemical burned through flesh, leaving blisters and blistering, gushing lesions on touch, their mouths and throats burst in excruciating pain almost quickly. Orrin, who had previously worked with chemicals, recognized the signs almost quickly. This was not vodka spiked with sleeping drugs. It was a corrosive chemical, perhaps a powerful acid. Based on the intense reaction, his best prediction was hydrochloric acid, a substance known to be toxic to organic tissue. Moran stated that Michelle had begged the guys to spare her, but her cries were ignored, and she was forced to drink the liquid. The men even attempted to use duct tape to seal the victims' lips shut while the acid was still inside. However, due to burn damage to their epidermis, the duct tape no longer adhered to their mouths. The inability to tape them shut caused the captives to scream and cry out in anguish, which infuriated the men. Orrin knew that drinking it would inflict lasting damage. So, initially, he spat it out. Because of this, they began beating him and forcing him to drink. So, in the end, Oren sucked it in and, desperate to survive, feigned to swallow it before gently allowing it to trickle out the sides of his lips. The agony was awful, yet it was far better than if it was inside of them. Looking around, Oren noticed the effects the drug was having on the others and began mimicking their behaviors as best he could. He was forced to see his own son's screams and spasms, as well as the others. The men used this chance to rob them, snatching their watches and other important items. As the victims suffered, the men became angrier with each passing second. Their tolerance had gone out, as if they had concluded from their arguments that everyone would and should die immediately. Finally, one of the men snapped. After taking his pistol from his waistband, he approached Carol and Courtney and shot each of them in the back of the head. Carol died instantaneously, but Courtney somehow survived the shot. The men also fired at Oren, but missed. Oren remained motionless, nevertheless. And, despite his persistent pain, he managed to remain silent. His goal was to convince the gunman that he was dead, as that was his best chance of surviving. Warren overheard one of the men urge his partner to go upstairs and return in approximately half an hour. The man happily complied. After he left, the man led Michelle to a different corner and instructed her to remove her clothes. After that, I am sure you can predict what transpired. He did it in front of everybody. Oren, remain as still as possible, and then listen to her final request. She begged the shooter to spare her life, but he ignored her pleas and hauled her naked back to the other victims. He threw her face first into the ground before shooting her in the back of the skull. The other man returned from upstairs, and they proceeded to check on their victims. This was when they knew Oren was still alive. The shooter knelt on Oren's chest, trying to strangle him with a wire. When it took too long, the gunman gave up and let go of his grasp. Oren gasped and coughed, yet he remained alive. As if Oren hadn't suffered enough, the second man shoved a pen into his ear, and both men stomped on it. They forced it through his eardrum and out through his throat. It should have killed him, but some miracle saved him alive. However, it was enough to persuade the soldiers that they had done enough. The crooks left Oren and the others in the basement, scooped up the rest of their possessions, and quickly disappeared in the getaway vehicle. A few hours later, Oren's wife and son found them. The police arrived immediately after 10:00 p.m. Stanley's terrified mother approached him in the parking lot, repeating, "They've been shot over and over again." Courtney was in critical condition and was not expected to survive. In actuality, he spent 266 days there, many of them in intensive care, before being liberated. Even after his discharge, he would never be able to resume his ordinary life. He suffered major brain injuries and amnesia. So much so that, when it came time for a trial, he was deemed unable to testify. Despite his own horrible injuries and lengthy rehabilitation, Oren Walker was able to furnish the police with a complete description of the two people that caused the catastrophe that night. He depicted the gentleman who fired the gun as a short black man with glasses and a Caribbean accent. The other man was similarly African American, but he was taller and had a larger build. In addition, Oren mentioned one of the vans driven by a third man. He mentioned that it was either yellow or cream in color. He also indicated that there could have been up to 3 more men than the 3 he could certainly identify. The investigators knew the crime had been painstakingly organized, but the amount of violence was so unwarranted that they were unsure whether it was personal or part of the motive. The following day, the probe received a huge boost when 2 adolescent guys went garbage diving and uncovered wallets and other possessions belonging to the high 5 victims. The dumpster was in an intriguing area. It was on Hill Air Force Base's property. Police eventually established that the culprits were airmen from Hill Air Force Base. Officers played it smart by bringing out all the airmen, resulting in a massive gathering around them. The detectives utilized this to their advantage, turning it into a performance. One of them brought the artifacts out and presented them to the audience one by one, observing the audience carefully for any reaction. The gamble paid off. The detective noticed two individuals in uniform. Unlike the others, these two appeared to be in panic. They also became progressively irritated as more articles were removed from the container. The detective noted that the two men were pacing up and down furiously and exchanging heated comments. The males also fit Oran Walker's description of the men and the killers. The two men in issue were Dale Pierre and William Andrews, names that had already been considered since, just hours after the murder was reported, an Air Force officer called in a tip citing both Pierre and Andrews' names, as well as a third, Keith Roberts. According to the report, the guys were heard talking about one day robbing the hi-fi store. Nobody took them seriously at the time, but that changed when it happened. A judge approved a search warrant for the men's barracks based on the tip and the detective's instincts. A warrant, however, would not be necessary. And the base commanders were happy to welcome them in. If these men were innocent, they wanted their reputations cleared, and if they were guilty, they wanted out of the Air Force, applause, immediately away. To put it plainly, the findings were damning for the three guys. First, the detectives uncovered a poster for the film Magnum Force. Although it appeared harmless enough, this poster would become a critical piece of evidence. See, in the film, there's a serial murderer who compels a woman to drink Dano, which kills her instantaneously. Perhaps this is what these folks expected to happen when they used it on the 5 victims in the basement. Later interviews revealed that all 3 men had seen the video multiple times. Furthermore, detectives uncovered pieces of paper hidden beneath the carpet. Between the carpet and the padding, there was a folded piece of paper. And when I opened the paper, it was a lease agreement for a storage facility just a block away from the hi-fi store. So we walked over to the storage facility that night and unlocked the door to discover it loaded with all of the stolen hi-fi equipment from the store. Perhaps more distressing was the list discovered by cops. The list contained numerous stores that marketed high-end merchandise. The hi-fi store was right at the top. If they hadn't been apprehended, would they have proceeded to rob and murder? Who would have been next? The final piece of evidence was a plastic jar containing the mystery liquid that the victims were compelled to ingest. So, what was the material that generated such horrible burns? Was Oran RY, assuming it was acid? The mystery substance was nothing more than a store-bought Drano brand sink blocker. The Magnum Forest poster suddenly took on new relevance. Finally, the hospital workers recognized what they were dealing with and could begin treating Courtney and Oran appropriately. In addition to Pierre, Andrew, and Roberts, the detectives suspect 3 more individuals were there. After finishing interviews, they determined that Roberts drove one of the 2 vans. Although they had suspicions about the other 3 guys, they were never able to gather sufficient evidence to indict them. To this day, they have never been apprehended. However, of the 3 survivors, Dale Pierre, 21, was by far the most vicious. He was the one who pulled the trigger and brought Michelle to the corner of the basement. I just kept shooting. I figured, I shot Mr. Nesbitt, so I just started shooting everyone else. Interestingly, just before to this and shortly after his arrival at the post, he became the primary suspect in the death of Air Force Sergeant Edward Jefferson on October 5, 1973. Pierre Dale Selby is an airman who serves at Hill Air Force Base. He is already a suspect in another murder. Police obtain a search warrant for his barracks. However, due to insufficient evidence, authorities were unable to pursue charges against him. And it's safe to assume that if he hadn't been captured, he would have continued to kill. He was living in the barracks near the dumpster where the things were discovered when the murders took place. Pierre was found guilty of 3 charges of first-degree murder and 2 counts of aggravated robbery for his involvement in the high-profile crimes. As a result, he received 3 death sentences, 1 for each murder victim in total. On August 28, 1987, at the age of 34, he was murdered by lethal injection. The second hi-fi killer was William Andrews, who was 19 years old. Like Pierre, he worked as a helicopter mechanic at Hill Air Force Base. During the trial, it was discovered that he and Pierre had always planned to kill everyone they encountered while robbing the store. He was also convicted of 3 first-degree murder charges and 2 counts of aggravated robbery. His death sentence was particularly contentious because he did not directly carry out the crimes, however he acknowledged to forcefully administering drano to the victims, which he believed would kill them. So he plainly intended to murder. Anyone who is human would feel regret for what transpired. I'm extremely ashamed of my involvement in that crime. I feel deep sympathy for the victims and their families. His execution was originally planned for August 22, 1989, however he was granted numerous stays of execution by the 10th Circuit Court of Appeal. However, on July 30, 1992, at the age of 37, it occurred after spending 18 years on execution row. Keith Roberts, who was 19 years old at the time of the crime, was the final man convicted. Initially, he denied any role in the crime, but during his trial, he finally acknowledged to being the getaway driver, claiming he expected the store to be empty. Apparently, until the incident came on the news, Roberts had no idea anyone had died. He was convicted of 2 charges of violent robbery and sentenced to 5 to life in prison, depending on his actions. Roberts was pardoned in 1987, after nearly 13 years in prison. He moved to Chandler, Oklahoma, to live with his relatives. By 1989, it was stated that he was working out of an electrical store. On August 8, 1992, just over a week after Andrew's execution, Roberts took a gun and left this world. Warren and Cody both survived the awful violence that they were subjected to. But their lives would never be the same. Warren lived until April 2000, when he died at the age of 69, and Courtney recovered from his injuries and his mother's loss. He returned to high school and graduated with his classmate in 1976. For a while, he appeared to be doing well, but he struggled to retain a permanent work and had to rely on Social Security to survive. Courtney died barely 2 years after Warren, on June 4, 2002, at the age of 44, after suffering from chronic pain since that dreadful night. So, that concludes this week's episode of Every Town. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you want more, check out our other videos right here. Join us next week for another weird tale, because you never know, your town may be next.